Drew Hartz, thank you for joining us on Conversations with Peter Boghossian. I say us because Reed's in the background there. You're a professor of clinical psychology at Long Island University. Tell us a little bit about your research and what you do. I find it fascinating.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I'm no longer a professor at Long Island University. I resigned to start the Open Therapy Institute,
Mm.
which is what I'm spending almost all my time doing right now. And that's an institute that's focused on addressing bias in mental health care and providing services for patient populations that are often overlooked because of bias in mental health care.
So,
Yeah.
what do you mean by bias?
Broadly, like different types of socio-political biases that come into the field. I think for a long time, the field has leaned left. It's about, among professors in psychology, it's about 17 liberals for one conservative. And over time, this has just led to issues not being addressed, perspectives not being addressed, patient populations not being addressed. There's a lot of assumptions in the field that patients have left-leaning values, a lot of cluelessness about people who have different values. I think the skill with people with different views has just gotten worse over time. And recently, the field's just become activist-oriented, social justice-oriented. Now training programs are just totally ensconced in social justice activism.
Well, we certainly have a lot to talk about. So, so how do those social and political contexts shape the symptoms of mental illness?
Well, there's somebody who's going to give a talk for us who's a professor at Fordham. His name's Dean McKay. He's a specialist in OCD. And he's noticed in his practice that more people that are coming in with symptoms of OCD are having repetitive, intrusive thoughts that they're going to say or do something that's going to get them canceled.
Wow.
So they worry about saying something that's un-PC or doing something that's un-PC, and the mob comes for them. Now, in OCD, one of the symptoms, the obsessions part of the symptom, are these repetitive intrusive thoughts. And they tend to fixate on whatever the things are that are most socially taboo. So in the past, they were more sexual, more aggressive. They're about social taboos or disease or things like that. Now they're getting more and more about cancel culture. And so in a way, the way that people have symptoms of mental illness is a mirror of what's happening in society. What does society value the most? What's the most taboo? What are the forces that are most impacting people's lives?
So that's like a meta fear, because it's not a fear of a specific thing. It's not a fear that's governed by a particular piece of ideological content.
Well, it's like, yeah, sometimes they're not always like reasonable. Like it could be, I'm going to blurt out the N-word or something. And they know they're not really going to do it, but they just know that if they did, it would ruin their lives. So they just kind of fixate on it. And they're so terrified that something like that could happen, even though that maybe they've never said the N-word in their entire life. But they know what would happen to them if they did. So it gets stuck in the mind. It's, what if I did this? What if I did this? And then it can come up in other ways, like, what if I'm talking to somebody who's of a different race, and what if I say this? Or I'm talking to a woman, and what if I make this joke or say this? And so they're kind of preoccupied with whatever the most socially taboo things are. And it just kind of gets stuck in repeat in their mind.
God, that must be like horrific to live like that. Like I just don't live like that at all. That must be utterly say appropriate jokes all the time. That must be completely horrific to live in that kind of pathological fear.
Yeah, I mean, and it's kind of like, it's scary because it's the most socially taboo thing. It's not like it's not, I'm going to murder somebody.
Yeah.
It's not, I'm going to even necessarily do something sexual or something. Different societies have different, or it's blasphemy. Like in some societies, it might be more about blasphemy. because that's the most taboo thing there. But in our society, it's this.
So is the accepted therapeutic modality to that? I would imagine that there's a suite of treatment modalities for that, but I'm spitballing here, but my guess is that one treatment is not, well, fuck it, if someone cancels you, that's on them, not on you. Like, do you ever teach, is that is there a vein of literature on that? Like, I just talked with Wilfred Riley, and he has a book called Taboo about that. Not about that, about those taboos.
About the social justice kind of taboos.
Yeah, and things you can't say. His book is excellent. But is that a recognized legitimate modality, like, or technique or way of thinking about it? Like, okay, if they cancel you, that's on them, not on you. So live however you want to live.
Sometimes people who have these thoughts, like, they know I'm not actually going to say or do that, and I know it's not rational for me to fear it, but they're still fixated on it. So even to the person who has it, sometimes they know it's not rational, or they might believe it's not rational, but they still get stuck on it. The cognitive behavioral therapy is the most widely used evidence-based therapy for it. And it tends to be more about actually exposure. So you actually talk in therapy about taboo stuff, and you kind of get comfortable with the fact that the world doesn't end when you talk about it. And that's a way of reducing that anxiety so that you're not stuck in that feedback loop.
So I'm just going to tell you something I've been thinking about. I use these podcasts to just talk to experts about that stuff. I think about it's kind of fun. So somebody knows that that's not rational, and they know that if something is rational, then I guess you'd have to really not beg the question with it, but isn't there a way to tie their rationality, like Plato says in the Republic, to be the lead horse of the chariot that directs the chariot? Like, if you know that this is an irrational thought, then wouldn't there be something in there to bootstrap the behavior?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
And you can, but the more primitive parts of the brain, the amygdala, or wherever the learned anxiety response is, you do have to train that to not have the response. And with phobias, you really do have to kind of teach the lower brain that getting in the elevator is okay, or holding the spider is okay, or whatever the fear might be. Because even if they know I don't need to worry about flying on a plane, they have this amygdala response that and they can be totally overwhelming. I mean, even if the person knows that they're okay rationally, that learned fear response can be super intense.
Yeah, the rational self is leading the desire and the spirit. Thanks, Reed. So that's the rational is the driver of the chariot. So I would imagine, and again, I'm spitballing here, the psychologist Bruce Hood says that there are reasons for fear of spiders, or evolutionary reasons for fear of spiders, and that those evolutionary reasons are not operative, for example, in flying in planes. And so I'd imagine that helping people overcome certain anxieties with evolutionary predilections, or grounded in a kind of I don't know why the phrase evolutionary truancy comes to mind. I just think I just made it up. I don't even know if it makes sense, but it sounds kind of cool. If there are certain fears that are easier to overcome if they're not evolutionary, like spiders, snakes, stuff like that.
That's interesting. I don't know. I don't know if the extinguished time is faster for certain things than others. It wouldn't surprise me. But those exposure therapies, they're very hard. They really demand a lot of clients, because you have to kind of like face that really aversive response and just kind of power through it. So even if you have to, often it's helpful to really have a support and somebody who's there with you, helping you push through it, because the response is intense.
So let me throw something out to you. I have a good friend of mine who graduated with a master's. I haven't talked to her in a while, but a master's in, which reminds me, I should probably contact her, clinical psychology. And she was telling me, I'm not going to name the name of the university, but it's in Portland, and you could probably figure it out, that it's when they did a section on homelessness, for example, they were taught to, first day, they were taught to ask the homeless people who are their clients, what are their pronouns?
Right.
First day. First thing that they do, not like, how to find the addiction clinic or what have you, or condoms or whatever, you just hot. And I was just so, I mean, even that to me, and I've heard it all, was rather extreme. And I hear this all the time. Oh, if your kid, if you think if your child suffers from gender dysphoria, send them to a, licensed therapist, a clinician, etc. But the problem is that the whole field has been captured. Academia has been captured. The whole thing has been captured. So basically, it's like, if I may borrow a religious metaphor, people hate it when I do this, but it's like you go to the priest and you say, hey, listen, I'm doubting my faith. The priest doesn't say, well, face towards Mecca and pray 5 times a day, right? The priest tells you to participate in the very thing that you're having questions with in the first place. And so, when the whole field it's just beholden to the ideology. So I'm not even sure why you would send your kid to a therapist if the therapist participates in those beliefs.
Well, I don't want to overstate the problem. I think there are still lots of really good therapists out there. And I do think that there's been biases, but there are good therapists that are conservative and good therapists that are liberal. The training programs, it's different. And some are better than others. All of them have a little bit of social justice. That's just part of any program in the field, as it is with most law schools and medical schools too. Some of them are really ideological, and some of them it's not very much. So there's just a big range. But the training programs, I think, are the most captured part of the field, and the most concerning part of the field. And I agree, it's a really big problem, and it's eroding trust in the profession, because like you're saying, why would you take your kid to see a therapist who has these really radical beliefs? And I think that people in the mental health field really need to wake up, that if they want to save their profession, I mean, I do think therapy can do a lot to help a lot of people who need it, and it's a really powerful tool. But it's going to destroy the public trust and its ability to do what it does if they don't address the bias problem immediately.
Yeah, I could not possibly agree with you more. So I go around the world, and Reed and I go around the world. We give a lot of talks. I give a lot of talks, and I'll ask people, who's a psychology major, at universities, and certain percentage of people will raise their hand. Obviously, it varies country to country and audience to audience. And then I'll say, who's heard of the replication crisis in psychology? Now, admittedly, sometimes it doesn't translate. Like I did this when I was in Romania, and the words might not translate. But I have not had a single person. Well, there was one school. I had one school when I was in Jackson, Mississippi. One person ever raised their hand to that question, and I'm flabbergasted by that. You even look surprised by that.
I'm surprised by that. Yes.
Yeah.
These are psychology students?
No, these are just general audiences, but there's a percentage of people, of students in literally everyone. There's always a cluster of psychology students. And again, some of that outside the Anglosphere can be attributed to something. Maybe they call it something else, and I don't speak whatever the language is, Slovakian. But well, so that's the other part of the crisis. There's the ideological capture is one part, and then you have the replication crisis. But the deeper thing there is that the replication crisis itself is not acknowledged by people. Like, there's not even an introductory Psych 101, hey, this is the replica. I mean, that would be my first order of business, that 50% of the things that we're studying may not be true. I'm going to give you what we think is established knowledge, but over time, I mean, I would just think that would be the first order of business.
Yeah, I mean, there are just huge problems with the research process, I think, across the social sciences. And
Imagine that.
yeah, it's just it is shocking how tepid the response is. Like, we're just going to keep going about business the same way. But there's you know, I mean, like a lot of people, you know, my training was more clinical and less research focused.
Yeah.
But people with more research focused training, especially, you know, if you do your study, you've got 50 hypotheses. If you come back and you don't have a number of significant results, your faculty are going to think you didn't try hard enough.
Yeah.
Because you're supposed to engineer significant results through excluding people and changing your tests and controlling for this or that and running to light, and then until you get the significance. And it's crazy how normalized those procedures are. It's a big part of why you have the replication crisis. And it's just maybe reform is just too daunting, because everything from how the journals are structured to how the IRBs are structured, I mean, everything is structured in this kind of dysfunctional paradigm. And reform is going to be a big undertaking. But
it would be amazing. It's so amazing. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it is daunting, but I find it incredibly disheartening. It's a kind of connivance. It's a so you have mass participation in professors who publish in, and that's the other thing. You were tenured, right? When your job?
No, I wasn't. No.
Okay, so it was easier to quit. So I had a job for life when I quit. So that was more difficult, but it's really astonishing. It's almost like the people who are forwarding propositions in the ideology, the equity on a positive side, which is anti-meritocratic, it's almost like they and their family don't go to surgeons. They don't fly in planes. Like, it's so crazy to me on so many levels that we don't fix what are obvious problems in the society. I mean, that's why I keep telling Reed, it's almost like I feel like, I don't know, either the simulation is coming to an end or it's just a mountain of stupid. It's like nobody I had Mark Pellegrino on, Wilfred Riley on. I'm asking people what they think the most. I probably shouldn't tell you their answer, and I should see what you answer. What the most pressing problem in the United States was. Well, why don't I, before I continue this train of thought, what do you think the most pressing problem in the United States is?
I think it's identity politics.
Okay, well, that would be a kind of subset of some of the other things. But two of the three people have said the national debt. Yet there's no national conversation on the net. Nobody's talking about it. Like, stop printing money, stop overspending. There are so many things that are just so unbelievably obvious to me. Like, but the ideological capture is so strong that the moral mind overrides the rational mind. Like, fire plagiarists, like fire them. Inexcusable fire plagiarists. Like, and then people worry, why is there a crisis? Why don't people trust this stuff? Well, you have a replication crisis. No one's fixing that. If anybody wants to fix it, you go after them, like so-called style papers. You don't fire plagiarists. You're printing money you don't have. You're saying it's just, you don't close the southern border, and then everyone's like, oh my God, I can't believe terrorists have come in. Really? That's really interesting. Nobody could have predicted that. So I guess the thing that's so frustrating to me is that the problems are they seem to me to be so easy to fix.
Well, what you're hitting on is something that's really important to me, which is the barrier. Maybe this goes back to what we're saying about the fear response, that you can have this response even when you know it's not rational. That non-rational, often unconscious part of the brain, I think, is really driving a lot of what we're seeing. It's emotionally driven. Ben Shapiro has the saying, facts don't care about your feelings.
Yeah.
And I think that quote encapsulates an insight, which is people are rejecting true information because they can't tolerate the emotions that are connected to it. And
that's interesting.
So I'm rejecting things that are true because I can't tolerate certain feelings. So the question is, what are the feelings they can't tolerate? and how are they operating to distort reality? This is what I think about every day with all of my patients, because that's what's keeping people stuck in whatever they're stuck in. There's something, some emotional imbalance, some difficult emotion or thought or experience that they're avoiding, and it's leading them to distort or behave in a dysfunctional way. And I think the best sometimes, look, I'm a fan of CBT. I'm not anti-CBT.
Yeah.
Sometimes you focus on thinking rationally, correcting distortions, that sort of thing. But another approach is to focus on the emotions, and how do we kind of make the things that you can't tolerate feeling a little bit more tolerable so that you can feel them, and then the thoughts follow from that.
Right. Okay. That's fascinating to me. So I have to ask you about this because I've been wondering about this for a long time. That's just, yeah, someone said so well said. That's so true. Okay. So I wrote down rejecting certain feelings. So so guide me through this because I've been thinking about this for decades. So in therapy, okay, so this is complicated. So I'm working through this in code. I'm working through this myself. So you don't want to face a certain reality because the feelings that come with that reality, you just don't want to face those feelings. So then you don't face that reality. That's correct, right? Is
I
that
guess, yeah,
roughly overstated, but basically
I
that's
think
the idea.
that's roughly, yes.
Okay, so help me understand this then. Isn't the assumption that's embedded in that whatever the reality is will not be as bad as you facing the feelings as a consequence of you understanding that reality?
I
Like,
don't,
yeah, go ahead.
I see what you're saying. I think it's, my guess is that it's much more primitive than that. I think the unconscious fantasy is, I want to have my cake and eat it too. I want to have two mutually exclusive things. I want whatever I want whenever I want it. I think it's much less. I think that the fantasy that drives that is more primitive,
Okay, so
not reality based. Yeah.
okay, so here's my thought, and it gets back to what I said to you before. So isn't the way to solve these problems through reason and rationality? Like, isn't the way to solve that to say, listen, this is just your amygdala or your and explain it exactly like you explained it to me. And like we can run through an example. Like here would be an example in the context of this conversation. Look, so someone's worried about being racist, so that they sit on they're a member of an administrative staff at a hospital. And so they put in equity concerns that they let in a certain percentage of African Americans who haven't met benchmarks. Heather McDonald talks about this, or writes about this.
Mhm.
And they do that because they want to either discharge these moral impulses within that administrative capacity, in their administrative capacity, or they do this because they're afraid of the feelings that they would face or afraid of cancellation or what have you. But isn't that not as bad as the ultimate reality that if you let people perform surgery on people who are not as qualified, they're going to die, and then that would be on their conscience? So isn't the way to modify behavior in those senses to continue to appeal to people's sense of reason and rationality? See, this is, I think this is my either my blind spot or what have you, because I always come back to that. And then I talk to people like you who are super qualified and actually know what they're talking about in a clinical setting. I don't know anything about clinical
Okay.
psychology.
So the number one tool, I think a prerequisite for the kind of rational conversation you want to have and that I want to have, is the ability to talk about pros and cons.
Okay.
There's two concepts that are really important. One is called splitting, the other is called ambivalence. And ambivalence in psychology is actually ambivalent. It doesn't mean, usually when you're ambivalent, it means you're wishy-washy in colloquial terms. But here in psychology, it means ambivalent. It means two contradictory emotions at the same time. It's the ability to say, I have strengths and weaknesses, you have strengths and weaknesses. There's things I like about this, there's things I don't like about this. And it's an emotional state. If you can't tolerate ambivalence, then you split. You frame yourself and other people in all or nothing terms. I only have strengths or I only have weaknesses. People who are depressed split a lot. They see themselves as all bad. And if you talk to somebody who's depressed, sometimes they're so negative about themselves, about the future, about everything. And you try to say, hey, is there any bright spot? Is there any strength? That they can't tolerate that. It's easier for that person in the short term to be depressed than to tolerate ambivalence in the short term.
Interesting.
So the cure for depression isn't be happy all the time. The cure is ambivalence. And that
well, just help me understand before we go on. So what do you mean by easier for them? Like emotionally easier? Easier is like the way they navigate
it's
the
distressing
reality?
to think about the reality of having strengths and weaknesses. There's an anxiety, a kind of distress that can come with that is in the short term unpleasant, but it's actually medicine. It's actually medicine. And when you can tolerate that issues and people and groups have positive and negative trends and dynamics and strengths and weaknesses, that's true of me, that's true of everybody else. When you can tolerate that, it's really distressing at first, but it's medicine, and it gets you to maturity. If you can't tolerate that, you end up being immature, emotionally dysregulated. You're framing everything in all or nothing terms, so your picture of reality is really distorted, and you end up self-sabotaging and doing things that hurt yourself and hurt others, and you don't understand a lot of what's happening. So the capacity to tolerate ambivalence is so key for individuals and for society. And I really think we're losing that capacity. So it's going to be hard for them to say, hey, what might a cost of illegal immigration might be? What might a cost of regulating gun ownership might be? Whatever the issue is, think about pros and cons. They can't tolerate it.
Yeah, when you said that, I kept thinking about maturity. That's just how mature people behave. That's the orientation that a mature person has toward the world. It's also, just parenthetically, the best villains in movies and shows. I love science fiction. They're always, they're never really like these just super evil monsters. They're always they have some nuance to them. They have some ambivalence. But that's what it's called to be emotionally mature. So I find that absolutely fascinating.
Look at these kids. Look at kids. Like if you want to have a controversial conversation about Heather McDonald's views on race or whatever it might be, and a lot of maybe less so, but recently, but not that long ago, you would see kids at college campuses, and they'd be in tears. They're shaking. They're violent. They can't control their body. They really can't tolerate the idea of ambiguity, pros and cons, thinking with nuance. It's an emotional capacity that they don't have, and I think that overrides the reason. They can rationalize anything. There's always a reason to rationalize why that shouldn't be said, or that's immoral, or that's not true. They'll rationalize after based on what they can tolerate feeling.
So I'm gonna throw a total curveball at you here.
Okay.
I'll say, could a way to deal with that as a kind of prophylactic against falling into splitting or the lack of emotional nuance, couldn't, and again, this is a total curveball, so I'm just telling you, couldn't raising someone on a steady diet of the Socratic method mitigate against some of those factors?
Yeah, I mean that they're questioned about what they believe, and so they have to deal with counter arguments regularly as part of their. I mean, I think this is the education system is totally central to why we're losing the capacity for ambivalence because if I knew people at the postdoctorate level who had never had a teacher or course or instructor or supervisor their entire life who was conservative or had conservative views openly.
Okay,
So
that's
they just knew
insane. Yeah.
nothing. They knew nothing about. So they just anybody who has those views just seems not just monstrous and crazy, but they really couldn't even emotionally tolerate being around it.
Yeah, it's interesting. And again, this is an N of two, but I was utterly merciless with my kids, my son in particular. I mean, truly intellectually merciless with him night after night for decades. But it was always in the context of a loving environment. And I would be merciless with his ideas as opposed to him. And then I would argue the other side. Like when we played chess, when he could swap sides at any point. Like, so he would led something interesting. But it does, I think, the educational system, the idea that you're exposed to different opinions, and that's exactly the opposite of what we're doing now. So when professors walk into the classroom with a moral agenda, they're looking at the institution as an indoctrination mill. And so that's antithetical to the purpose, Jonathan Haidt talks about this, of what the telos of the institution should be. And at the very least, I don't know, I think Greg Lukianoff was telling me he doesn't like the word resilience to create intellectually resilient people, but I think the way that you framed that was so interesting. Let me throw this out to you. Let me ask you this question. I see if your insight, you can help me figure out this. So Reed and I were at UCLA, and we do this spectrum street epistemology stuff where we put people on a horseshoe. That was Reed's innovation, by the way. I was putting people on lines. Reed was putting people, genius innovation. Anyway, so that way people who disagree can look at each other in the eyes, where if they're on their lines, they can't look at each other. Yeah. But anyway, so we wanted to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian situation, and there was literally, what do you say, Reed, like 200 feet from us, there was a massive protest against Israel by students. And we found somebody to argue the pro-Israeli side, but we couldn't find anybody. And I stood as the people walked by, and I said, listen, talk to us. Let's have this conversation. Nobody, of course, nobody. So what do you think is going on there? They were, and just to be clear, I heard the word Hamas 2 or 3 times. So this isn't just like a Palestinian thing. There's something else going on there. Oh yeah, Reed's playing some of the videos there, and I have the videos on my phone too. And that was at UCL. That was a few days ago.
Yeah. Well, I know you and I had talked about the possibility of this defense called disavowal. And I'll share what that is, but I'm having, since we've talked, I'm thinking maybe it's something else. But disavowal is when you don't believe what you're saying. You don't believe your own stuff. And the example that I gave was a few years ago when there were wildfires in Canada and all the smoke had come down into New York City. I was talking to a colleague who said, this makes me really concerned about climate change.
Right.
And I said to her, I actually don't think the wildfires are directly related to climate change. And she said, yeah, but still. And that's a perfect example of disavowal, where you're saying, yeah, I know this isn't true, but I'm going to believe it anyway, or I'm going to act as if it's true anyway. And we had been thinking maybe the reason why protesters wouldn't want to talk to you is they don't quite even believe their own ideology, but they want to pretend as if it's true.
Exactly.
Exactly. And I do think there's a lot of that. There's a lot of claims like that people make that they don't even really believe is true, but they want to act as if they're true. That's the smoke in New York. But I wonder if the other side of it is that it has to do with this inability to tolerate ambivalence, that just being around somebody who has a different view is just really unbearable for them. And they can't tolerate being around it.
Okay, so okay, a few things. So just that guy in that who was being harassed, he was the guy. His Cam Higby is his name. I think he's an independent journalist, but I'm not sure.
Mhm.
But so that guy, he wanted to do spectrum street epistemology, and I made him go to the other side to defend the pro Hamas position because we couldn't find anybody. We literally couldn't find anybody. It's funny. They're 200 feet away. They're screaming about all these things. Yeah, there he is, Cam Higby. Mob riot at UCLA grabbed my harness and pulled me while also pushing me from behind, and I'm concerned, then began to hit me and grab for my phone. So we literally had that guy on our doing spectrum street epistemology immediately before that. But so okay, so help me understand this. Okay, so you're looking at this from an emotional and obviously psychological point of view. I'm looking at this from a rational point of view. The assumptions embedded in this discourse on my end are that the rational mind, if trained sufficiently, can be taught to keep moral impulses and emotional impulses at bay, partially through a kind of, and again, this is my own shtick, but partially through a kind of questioning, a kind of repeated exposure to Socratic questioning. So it would seem to me that if you, and again, please correct me if you think that my reasoning is in error. It's complicated. I'm thinking through it now, but it would seem to me that if we embedded it in a K through 12 and higher educational context, a kind of Popperian idea of falsifiability, but with moral ideas as well, all ideas. Like you think Hamas is great. Look, you're entitled to think whatever you want, but you have to know the other side of the side. You have to know the other side. And right now, kids are being fed a steady dose of the far left identitarian side, and they're not being fed. They're not even being fed. They're not even being exposed. And that not only does that create a kind of epistemological sinkhole that one falls into, but it prevents it makes it far less likely that the rational mind will be able to override the social mind, the feeling of tribalism and belonging, etc., because they haven't been told that it's a value to understand the other side of the issue. Sorry, I talked a lot, but is that the basic idea?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the violence or the physical harassment that we were seeing a minute ago, that is very psychologically primitive, and I think the idea, what Freud would say is if you act out what you can't talk about, and the idea that they're acting in such a impulsive, I think, irrational way shows how profoundly they're unable to have dialogue, and it does communicate the severity of the problem. Thinking about what you're saying about, well, no, I'm very much in favor of the, I think the rational capacity of human beings is incredibly valuable and powerful, and but I would say from an emotional standpoint, my step one would be, let's frame each side as having pros and cons. You got to come up with a few for each side to cultivate that ambivalence or dialectical thinking. You got to be able to talk about pros and cons and get comfortable with that first. And then we can say, okay, because if we have a conversation where I say, my side's 100% right, good at everything, your side's crazy, stupid, and evil, that's one type of conversation. If I say my side has a lot of pros, it's got some cons, but it's got a lot of pros, and I think I'm right. Your side has some pros too, but it's much more cons and not as good. That second conversation is such a qualitatively different type of conversation. We want to get people into that second type of conversation because I think the first type isn't amenable to rationality. I think it's too primitive. It's too emotionally driven. That the second conversation can. can
Sorry.
have rationality. No
I forgot
problem.
to turn off my phone. Sorry. So the reason that we're not gearing our institutions toward more dialectic forms of engagement is because they've been captured.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think, and they don't want to concede any room for somebody who has a view on the other side of the dialectic. And you have to actually have people making arguments on the other side in order to have a dialogue. And a lot of university departments, a lot of schools and institutions, they don't have one person.
So that's just crazy to me. It's just, again, an example of something that's so obvious as a way to restore public trust in the institutions. It's just so obvious to me.
Well, there's a really great story about this, a great example. So this splitting concept, it's used most, the place where it's talked about the most is psychiatric inpatient units.
Interesting.
And what happens, the classic example, this is the classic example, is somebody who has borderline personality disorder goes into the psychiatric inpatient unit. And let's say it's a young woman who self-harms. Okay. She cuts. And what she says, usually prototypically, there's some staff that she's really friendly to and she's kind of charismatic with. And there's some staff that she hates and she antagonizes and they hate her back. Okay.
Huh.
And she says, I'd cut less if you give me extra time in the arts and crafts room. And the staff who like her and who she likes says, you know what? Extra time in the arts and crafts room, it's a coping skill. We're here to teach people coping skills. Let's let her use this coping skill. The staff that don't like her say, wait a second, she's using the threat of cutting to get a privilege that nobody else gets. We're reinforcing her threatening to cut to give her something she doesn't want. So they take different sides. And they start to fight, basically. And they can enact, when you're in rounds on the inpatient unit, which psychiatric inpatient units are emotionally intense places, by the way. There's a lot of intense emotionality happening. So you can divide up into camps and they start to fight. And that's why the head attending has to say, hold up, we're splitting. The patient splits, views people as all good or all bad, and the unit can get sucked into it. And if they don't call it out, if the attending doesn't name this process and address it, you get chaos on the unit. It spreads to all the patients. It spreads to all the staff. People's symptoms get worse, and it's totally dysregulating. So we kind of are seeing that same pattern at universities or other institutions where everybody's getting sucked in, and there's nobody at the top saying, we have to be dialectical.
God, that's so interesting to me. And do you think, I'm sure it's covariant and I'm sure there are a lot of reasons for it. I'm trying to dumb down my vocabulary a little bit. I've got some criticism. I was going to say multivariate, but but I think, you just speak like that because it's just a more precise way of speaking. But so do you think it's because at some point those people in the administration lack a kind of maturity to see those ambiguities, or is it governed by other factors like financial concerns or how they're viewed by their colleagues and this is morally fashionable? Like, so if the attending in that clinical setting, that institutionalized clinical setting, would err on one side, could one make a prediction on which side the attending would err based upon his psychological maturity?
I mean, I think if the attending is immature, that would make it more likely that they'll fall into the enactment of the splitting.
Exactly.
But part of it might just be people being aware of this process, because and this is maybe going back to the rationality thing, where it's like when you point it out and you're like, we can't talk about things in all or nothing terms. it's clearly forcing us to engage in this enactment where we split up and hate each other and try to destroy each other. And it's and institutions are getting captured, and then they're losing their trust and becoming dysfunctional. I mean, when you point it out, hopefully there is some ability to appeal to reason and people to say, you know what, okay, institutions are going to function better if they're dialectical.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know. Maybe not every institution is going to respond that way, but hopefully some will.
So, okay. So let me ask you, let me switch gears for a second. So what's the difference between, and then I'll tell you why I'm asking you this a second if you want to know. What's the difference between stress and anxiety?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an overlap between the two. I think stress, I'm trying to go back to like remember my school. Stress has to do with adjusting to changes psychologically, and anxiety is usually related to worry and the embodied component of worry. But I see what I think where you're going is that there's a ton of overlap between the two. And people in therapy say stress all the time when they mean anxiety. All the time. And I think it's because it's safer. It's safer to say I'm stressed than I'm anxious. It's there's certain things like people can say that, you know, that's frustrating. That's an easier thing to say than I'm angry.
Yeah. Do you think that if somebody says, so ChatGPT, Reed just posted this, stress is a response to external pressures and is usually short-term and related to specific situations. Anxiety is more persistent, internal feeling of worry or fear, often without a specific trigger that may require professional intervention. Thanks, Reed, for posting that. So I'm asking you that question for a number of reasons. What one of which is, we're going back to what you said. If they say they're anxious, is that, are they afraid that that's a kind of internal weakness? But if they're like a mental condition or something, but if they say they're stressed, that's just a response to external stimuli? Is that why they say they're stressed?
I think stress is just less stigmatized than anxiety. And so it's okay to be stressed, and maybe people have an internal judgment about feeling anxious. You know, they're both normal. I mean, that's most people are going to feel anxious in your life. It's one of the feelings that we have in our psyche that people have. So just because you have some anxiety, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem. I would think if it's like really extreme or persistent or unusual in some way, or really impairing functioning or something, that's when you'd need attention.
Yeah, it's interesting because my life has zero stress but extraordinarily high anxiety. But my anxiety is a manifestation, or it's caused by external conditions. So like this culture war is just nasty business. I mean, extraordinarily nasty business. I've been threatened. I mean, every conceivable thing. I had to move out of my home. I've been assaulted. But you know, when I go on vacation, and particularly Eastern Europe, it's like I have zero anxiety. But I was wondering, you know, when people will say something to me, you know, I'll say, you know, we talk about stress and anxiety. I say, well, I have like zero stress in my life, and my anxiety is through the roof constantly. I think that's why I've never had a midlife crisis, because my life is constantly. So, you know, I know this is in an area in which you work, but can you tell something? Are there any things you can do to help people who are suffering from stress or anxiety? Like, what would you recommend?
Well, when you say that you have constant anxiety, is there specific worry about it? Like, is it about somebody attacking you, or
it's about like literally everything you could think of, but it's 100% related to what I do for a living.
Mm-hmm.
It's 100% related to the culture war. Like 100. I never have. I'm not anxious that the Martians are going to come and kidnap me, or that my water vein is going to break, or that a mass gunman is going to come in here and just like kill Reed and I.
Yeah. Um, I, there's a number of different ways to work with anxiety. Since we're kind of focusing on emotion focused ways, maybe I'll suggest some there. Um, Sometimes people are anxious of another feeling. So I'm worried about having a particular feeling or a particular state. Maybe it's losing, maybe it's having a regret, maybe it's feeling disempowered, maybe they're anxious about feeling sad or anxious about feeling lonely, or sometimes, so there's what can happen. This is broadly how I think clinically a lot, is that often people get stuck feeling too much of one thing because they can't feel something else, just as a general rule. And so people can feel a lot of anger if they can't tolerate sadness, or they can feel a lot of sadness if they can't tolerate anger. And I think people sometimes get stuck with anxiety because there's some other feelings that they're afraid of happening. And they could be a wide range of stuff. With trauma, there's a ton of anxiety because anything that triggers these unbearable trauma feelings, you're going to want to avoid and you're going to be anxious about encountering. So there can be a lot of anxiety with people who've had trauma, but it doesn't have to be that. It could be social anxiety. You're worried about being judged, but it can be so I think a lot of times the goal is to try to connect to more the full range of feelings that people have, so that you're not overloaded on one thing like anxiety. And that often requires engaging these other feelings and detoxifying them a bit so that you can have more balance.
Okay, so not necessarily to use you as a free therapist, my pro bono therapist for a moment, but I've noticed that my anxiety goes to zero when I'm doing one of two activities. When I'm doing jujitsu, because I have no phone, I think, and when I speak in front of people, particularly large groups, I have like negative anxiety.
Huh. So what's the question?
I don't know if there's a question. There's a comment. I was hoping you could make an inference about my mental life, my mental
tend
health.
to think it's not good. Watch it. Sorry. I tend to think, I forgot the name of the curve, but it's an inverted horseshoe with anxiety. I think most of the time you don't want zero anxiety.
Oh, like a Gaussian curve or a reverse Gaussian, like that, or like this?
Like this, where maybe the y-axis is performance and the x-axis is the Yerkes-Dodson model for people.
Okay.
But it's you want to have the optimal level of anxiety. If you're taking a test in school, you don't want zero anxiety. You don't want to have a panic attack. You want to be in the middle, where you're worried about the test because the test is important. That's why you care about it, but not distracted where you can't think clearly about it. There it is. So you want to have that optimal level of anxiety. So anxiety is not inherently a bad thing, or this is arousal, which is similar to anxiety, but not But so you want to have some, that's going to improve performance, is having some anxiety. When you get to doing tasks, you want to have a little bit. That's your fuel. It's your motivation. It can be a positive thing. It's more about it not being too much on the extremes.
So just real quick, and then I won't reveal any more of my psychology. So like whenever people want to fight me in real life, or whenever I'm in an adversarial conflict, like my anxiety just drops to zero. Like I just find myself so at peace when someone wants to hit me, or when somebody wants to argue with me or scream at me. I just find myself, most of the time, not always. I can think of a couple exceptions to that I've lost my temper, but I very, very rarely lose my temper. But very, very rarely. But so what is going on there? Like
it sounds to me, I mean, I'm like grasping at straws, but it sounds to me like a flow state. Like when you're doing jujitsu or when you're speaking, those are, you're in the zone. And it sounds like you get into this kind of focused, peaceful kind of zone that, really peak performers, when they do the thing that they do, it's playing basketball or it's playing jazz or whatever. When they do that, they get into that flow state, and they can be really peaceful and really focused and really, I think, gratifying. That's what it sounds like to me. I mean, I'm not sure if that's what your experience is.
Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, so I'm sure you've heard enough of my mental state. You don't want to hear anymore.
Yeah. Well, can I say one thing? I think one thing that I'd say is about therapy. Okay, the best thing that makes it valuable is that it's idiosyncratic. It's not generic advice. You get to learn about what makes a person unique and all the different factors that are related to them. And you're not just giving some kind of generic thing. The generic advice can be helpful. It's good. It's like exercise, get 8 hours of sleep, drink water. There's stuff like that it's good advice. Do it, but it's like, but the benefit of therapy is really being able to look at the full nuances of somebody's life and go deeper into it. And there's limitations of what generic stuff can do.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think it's because I have gray hair now. I'm not really sure, but a lot of people ask me for advice about stuff, and I always tell them the same. I give the same advice to literally everybody, independent of age or anything. It's like a triangle: diet, sleep, exercise. Cut the fucking sugar out. Like, just stop it. No more sugar in your coffee. No more soft. Like, stop it. No more desserts. Stop it. It's literally killing you.
Right.
So, and eat more vegetables, etc. And sleep. Try to sleep. Don't sleep shame yourself. Try to go to bed a little earlier. Don't drink alcohol before you go to bed. Have blackout curtains. Basic stuff. And exercise. And I had to talk a little bit about that. And it seems to me that that's a kind of a mantra that one can always fall back on. That it makes, if those three things are in order, it's far easier to solve other problems in one's life.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Basic stuff, basic balance in life, avoiding excess. Like, a lot of this stuff is really timeless, and it helps. Yep.
Okay, cool. So we have a few super chats here. Maybe when I come to New York, you'll be my pro bono.
Okay.
Cool. I'll take you out to great lunch. Okay. I'm in the mental health, and I can attest to capture. I may have some OCD now in a way I never did. So that's interesting. I'm in the mental health field, I guess. Yeah. And I may have some OCD now. So to me, I read that question as that being around these people could amplify the negative traits just because of the capture.
Yeah. I mean, people in the field are, I think a lot of people in the mental health field are really terrified because, you're dependent for your practice, you're dependent on referrals. Colleagues have to think of you as, I'd want to send a patient to this person. And if they quietly blacklist you because you have a viewpoint they don't like, it can be a professional disaster. And it's one of the reasons why I think people are so scared about speaking up. And a lot of the professional bodies, the conferences and stuff, have gone totally bonkers.
Yeah.
There's really extreme stuff going on at a lot of those places. Now, a majority of therapists have left, but still the official bodies they just get more and more and more radical.
Let me I just want to linger on that for a second. It would seem to me that if we want our institutions to regain the public trust, it's not just enough that I don't want to say disavow the ideologies in which they participated, but they need something else than that. They need to say, look, we made a mistake. We were held hostage to some orthodoxy. We thought it was the right thing to do. We're sorry. Like some kind of sincere contrition, and this is what we're going to do to to mitigate against the likelihood of that happening in the future. But basically saying, listen, we're sorry, we screwed up. We're going to get back to our original, we're going to discharge our mission, our telos. But even when I see academic institutions no longer requiring diversity statements from people, it's just like swept under the rug. It's quiet. Nobody's saying, listen, we made a mistake. We're sorry. We're wrong.
Yeah.
We're sorry if we've hurt people. We were trying to do the best thing that we can do, but ecce homo, we're humans. I'm only human. And going forward, these are the steps we're going to take in place. Like, it would seem to me that's so easy and so obvious, but literally nobody does it. Literally nobody does it. And the consequence of that is that we don't regain trust in our institutions. That would be the first thing I would do if I were to. Of course, I would never be in that position because of who I am. But wouldn't it seem to be? It would have to be more than just disavowal. You'd need an apology.
Yeah, and you need really pretty major structural reform. I mean, the number of perspectives and issues that aren't addressed in the field. I mean, it's really at the point that it's harming care, in my opinion. And
for sure.
To fix that requires pretty radical structural change. And I think, acknowledging the problem is the first step, but they need to actually, I think change how a lot of these organizations are structured.
Okay, we've got a next one. Reed, could you put that up? Thanks. Var show for $5. Have you noticed that people who go into undergraduate psychology often appear to have observable mental problems? Asking for a friend.
Yeah, I mean, that's true of graduate psychology too. The programs try to, screen out for people that are more mature and stable, but I don't know. Maybe I don't think that's necessarily a problem. In the sense that if they do figure themselves out and they can use those insights to help other people, that's often the most valuable thing. Is somebody I remember. There were some people in doctoral programs who had never been in therapy before. And I just don't understand how you could be a therapist if you've never been in therapy yourself. I don't know. I think you gotta go on, but it does, it can, if it's not checked. I mean, you don't want people who are really unstable dominating your field either. So.
Yeah, I'm thinking about experience I had when my friend couldn't make his therapy session, and he checked with his therapist. He said I could go, and I went to his therapist. I didn't really want to go. He told me to go.
What?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that was interesting. And she clearly seemed to me like she had, I don't know, some issues. I don't know, but it was rather obvious to me. I'll tell you a very quick story. I can't say this person's name because they move at high levels in the public space. But this person was telling me that their stress was, and I want to even hide their pronouns. Their stress was so high that this person's life partner was telling them they have to go to a psychiatrist or a therapist, and they went to the. This is a totally true story. They went to the therapist, and this individual said all the things that was going on with him. Like people were trying to dox him. People were just literally the craziest things. And she said at this, she extended the session, and then she basically said that again, I'm trying to conceal this person's identity because I don't want to betray any confidence. That this person was suffering from, this, I can't remember exactly, acute paranoia, some kind of acute paranoia. And then the next day, my friend came in and showed her all the receipts, like all the emails, like everything people had said, all the police reports, everything. So again, when you move in this space, this is the kind of thing that happens to you. But when you explain this to normal people who don't move in this space, they just can't fathom that you go through this shit. Like they just utterly can't. And then the therapist said to this person, you don't need a psychologist immediately, you need to go to the police immediately. Like, this is what you do. This is your first order of business. But it's
Huh.
but it's very hard to say, like, if I say, well, I got doxxed the other day, which I did, or if I say, my email got bombed, which it did, or my assistant's email got bombed, which it did. Like, if you say these things to people, like, I was chased out of my home, someone spit on me, like, people are like, he's insane. Like, this does not happen. This does not happen.
Yeah, I had that experience too, because I remember when I was trying to tell people how bad universities had gotten. And I remember telling people, like, they think calling for genocide against the non-protected groups is okay, but you can't commit a microaggression against the protected groups. And I would get this reaction from people like, okay, Andrew, I'm sure there's bias, but that's really not believable. That's not really true. And it wasn't until the congressional testimony happened where they all said that's what they believe, that it was like, okay, I wasn't making it up, but it wasn't believable. And so much of what people experience isn't believable.
Yeah, so I think, we didn't talk about this, but I think that there's something else going on there, from critical race theory, from the oppressor-oppression narrative. I think, and I'll be incredibly blunt with you, I think a very significant, I don't know what percentage of it is, but I think to say the least, non-trivial percentage of these people are Jew haters. I just think they hate Jews. I think they're rabid Jew haters. And so I used to get tremendous grief in the atheist, when I was doing the new atheist stuff, where I said, if somebody tells you that the punishment for apostasy is death, you should thank them. Not for wanting to kill infidels, but that they're honest with you. As opposed to like, well, punishment, well, it depends upon, and this happens to me repeatedly. I think I wrote about this in a paper, and happened to me in Sydney when I was talking to this guy from he ran a Muslim museum. I think it was in Melbourne. Pretty sure it was in Melbourne. But there is something about being honest with people that I think that, for example, the protesters were not. Like, if you hate Jews, just say I hate Jews.
Right.
Like, don't make it about anything. It's like, I hate Jews. Okay, well, I think that's a pathological, that there's something deeply wrong with you. But now, so that allows for the possibility of an intervention, because now you actually know what the issue is, as opposed to something unrelated to that.
Yes.
Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much aggression, and it's disowned a lot of time, and it makes it harder to address. It's all kind of like, it's all this aggression that's couched as like in this language of idealism, but it's all there's this unmistakable desire to hurt people that I think is really visible.
Yeah, and that, I think, is not only coupled with and bundled with a, if not overt, repudiation of dialogue, but a refusal to engage in any kind of communicative action, as Habermas would say, any kind of discourse with people. I think that is what embeds their situation. All right, we got one from Jordan here. Have you observed any trends in access to care, positive or negative, in the last several years? Perhaps more access, but lower standards of care?
Well, it's been teletherapy is the big change. And, before COVID, I don't think I knew anybody who did teletherapy, maybe one person, just nobody did it. And now, I'm in New York and somebody's on the other side of the town and they'd rather do teletherapy than commute over. It's good. I guess it's better to have teletherapy than nothing, but I really hope people don't diminish the value of in-person. You get so much more information about a person. The connection is so much stronger. So much of what therapy is about is nonverbal, sharing feelings and emotions together in a connection. And all of that, I think, is weaker on teletherapy platforms.
Oh, that's interesting. Are there any studies that show that in-person increases the likelihood of positive outcomes?
I think no, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the data is going to be that strong. A lot of psychotherapy research, it's like, I don't know, but I feel it and I experience it with my patients, and I'm not sure how best to capture those things in data. I think a lot of people, for example, if they're on teletherapy, if they open up emotion, because you're not in the room with them, they feel more alone in what
Oh,
they're talking
interesting.
about and less supported, and so it makes it. They don't think though, oh, this would be easier if I was in person. They think I don't like therapy or therapy's not working for me or something. I did see a question about what is teletherapy. It's just online therapy, Zoom
Yeah.
therapy.
I think people presume callosity. I think that's the word, callosity, like a lack of capacity or feeling for emotion. And I don't think that that's what's going on with many of these people. If anything, it's a seems to be a hyper attenuation to these things. Someone asked a question here. Well, do you think Chat GPT? I've been playing around with Chat GPT. 92126 ChatGPT therapists will dominate, or do you think that like ChatGPT 5 or 6, do you think that there'll be people will want to go to those for anonymity or better
Um,
outcomes? Or
I mean, the best predictor of therapeutic outcome is the connection that a client has with the therapist. The
mm,
connection. It's the therapeutic alliance. That connection
therapeutic alliance.
is the best predictor of outcome. So it's such a human, alive, interpersonal connection is so central to what drives good outcomes that I
Huh.
think it will be one of the last things that ChatGPT or anything like that learns how to do. By the time it learns how to do that, it will have learned how to do everything else, I think, along the way. Um,
Yeah, I find it to be. I still think that it's in its infancy. I've been putting out tweets about ChatGPT, and I debated, quote unquote, debated ChatGPT a few times. I think we obviously need to refine the process and fix the fonts and fix the prompts. But I think at this level of technology, I don't see that happening. But if it is the therapeutic alliance that's the governing or determining factor in outpatient outcomes, then I guess what would have to change is that there have to be a kind of cultural sea change about how people viewed, like the movie Her. I don't know if you saw the movie Her.
yeah.
Yeah, there'd be, excuse me, there'd have to be a kind of sea change in the way that people viewed these ersatz AIs.
Well, I'm not. Let's even putting it a different way. I don't know that you want a perfect therapist. Right? You kind of need somebody who's helpful and gets it right, but gets it wrong sometimes too. That's an important part of the process. It's like having a perfect parent or something. That'll mess up a kid's development if the parents are just
Oh,
perfect all the time.
interesting.
You gotta grow and think and reflect and challenge. And there's this whole interpersonal back and forth that has to happen. And I don't know how that attunement could really and yeah, I think it'll be one of the last things it learns how to do if it does.
Yeah, that's interesting. I view the current. I've been pretty bearish on many elements, certainly short term in American society. Therapy is one. It's like a pestiferous invasion of cultural values into the zeitgeist, like almost like inserting it directly into people's consciousness. And I think nowhere is that more clear than the gender thing, the trans thing, the
Yeah.
gender affirming care. And now all of the data, Schellenberger has done a great job from that. Um, he's done a great job of that. I'm deeply concerned. I am I concerned, let me phrase it this way. Am I concerned that people not receiving the care that they need and they're harming themselves? Yes. With that being said, I am more concerned with the field as a whole. And because I think we need that. We people need help, and they need to rely upon. And it's almost as if our institutions and our what we've constructed are so ideologically beholden that they just cannot do the most basic things to fix themselves.
Well, I think, I think there's a lot of reasons why, especially right now, people are down on therapy. One is it got really idealized a few years ago, and it was super trendy not that long ago, and it was just obvious that the wave was going to crash. Another issue has to do with the severe politicization of the field. Another one is there's a lot of like social media and maybe like Gen Z use of these pseudo therapy isms that don't really come from the mental health field, but they sound kind of therapeutic. I talked to a kid, and they were talking about how they think they and their girlfriend, or he and his girlfriend, were like trauma bonding or something like that. And it's like, I don't know that there's any literature on trauma bonding. They're just coining these therapy sounding terms, and often in ways that are harmful. The activists will kind of say they have a right to be aggressive to others because they're traumatized by institutional racism or sexism or something. There's no evidence that being aggressive to other people is going to help your trauma, if you even have trauma.
Yeah.
But all this is used in this really loose, unscientific, undisciplined way. Like, oh, you can't, a really dysfunctional way. So there is this kind of pop therapyism stuff. I think that's also making people hate therapy, because you don't need a lot of people kind of giving you this BS therapyism crap to just hate therapy. And I think a lot of people respond that way. I was there's a lot of talk about rumination.
Interesting.
I work with all of my patients to reduce rumination. If therapy's done right, you reduce rumination, because you reflect through why you're ruminating so that you don't need to do it on your own. But it's the idea that therapy increases rumination. I think that's just not the way to do it. So I think there's lots of ways that the field is being challenged right now.
Interesting. All right, let's whip through some of these. Garbled words for $5. That's right. I am scared of not getting referrals. I want to put myself, and yet I don't. It's awful. Yeah, God, that must be just really hard for people. Like, truly, that must be difficult. Let's do his next one, Reed, or her next one. Garbled words, $5. That's right. I'm scared of outing my heterodox views in the mental health field and getting blacklisted. That's just like.
Well, that's such a big part of why we wanted to make the Open Therapy Institute, was that I think the large majority of patients want a non-woke therapist. That's what they want. If we can serve them, then therapists who want to come out can come out and realize that there's a huge patient population for them, and they're underserved. I think they're some of the most underserved patients, because if you want a non-woke therapist, where do you go? If you pick somebody at random, there's a good chance that they're not going to have values that you want to work with. So that was a big part of why we created it, was both to serve patients, but also for therapists who wanted to come out, that they could do it without risking their income.
Yeah, I think that's just absolutely fantastic. Let's do a couple more, and then I want to talk a little bit about that. Trader Bear, good friend of the show, $9.99. SJWs have consistent narcissistic supply from online display, histrionic behavior, regularly cluster B world.
Can I jump in on this one?
100%.
Okay. So the cluster B thing. Yes. What is the number one contributor to cluster B personality disorders? Splitting. It's an inability to tolerate ambivalence. The treatments for cluster B personality disorders, it's dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, it's psychoanalytic approaches. They all prioritize splitting. The focus is on splitting. So much of what we're seeing, if it's narcissism, if it's histrionic, if it's borderline, whatever it is, it's so driven by splitting. And so it's just more evidence that that's the central, I think, issue driving insanity at institutions.
God, that's so interesting. Garbled words for $5. Our professional association made a statement supporting gender-affirming care, and they have a monopoly in my state. Okay, well, now we know why he's going by garbled words and not his real name for $5. So I mean, I don't even, I mean, the problem is, God, the problem is just so monstrous because it's just like it's like one of those worms that just burrows its way in and then it's, I keep trying to get out of this or move adjacent to the culture war, but it's almost impossible. It's just metastasized to such a crazy extent that it's just destroying the whole country from within. I mean, it's truly destroying. And I just lost $1,000 bet with Chris Rufo.
I
Reed, pull that
know.
up. Pull that up while we're talking about that. My bet. I was Pollyanna. I thought that within 6 months the stuff would really see its end. I should have said a year, but even
Well,
then,
it's a
Pollyanna.
the difference is how long will it take for individuals to kind of change their minds on woke stuff, and how long will it take for institutions? These institutions that have been captured are going to be really hard to
Yeah.
reform.
So look at this. So it's been 6 months, and I won the bet with Peter Boghossian. Peter, please send $1,000 to the whistleblower who exposed the child sex change program at Children's Texas Hospital here. Bet accepted. We revisit my prediction. Reed, click on the prediction, if you will, if you can find it. But I couldn't think of $1,000 to go to a better. Let's see. My radical prediction: this will be deleted in approximately 6 months. Government-wide strategic plan to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility in the federal workforce. So I was dead wrong about that. It's still there. I thought for sure people would come to their senses by now, but no, the rot is too deep. It's a universal solvent that destroys everything it touches. And there is something particularly pernicious. I don't want to be myopic and say that, oh, this age and this ideology is the worst there's ever been. But there really certainly does seem to be something to a kind of corrosive rot that eats the brains of believers out. And I don't know. But anyway, I was wrong and I lost $1,000. But getting back to the therapy thing, just thinking about where I'm going to get that $1,000. Getting back to the therapy thing, I mean, garbled words is right. Like our professional association made a statement supporting gender affirming care, and they have a monopoly in my state. And there's just no speaking back to these people. There's just no kind of like. It doesn't matter what the CAS report says. It doesn't.
The trans. My experience is that the trans activists are the most extreme. I mean,
No question.
I've written controversial stuff about a range of topics. I compare that to people who write very balanced and sensible stuff about transgender care, not and the viciousness with which they're attacked is just way beyond anything I've experienced. It's really, really shocking. But those activists are definitely the scariest in my experience.
Yeah, Schellenberger has to get cameras and such around his house. I mean, I have tons of guns here. I sleep with a gun on a Glock and my right by my bed. I keep the clip out of the block. Other people who live here out of the Glock, but there is something extra crazy. And when Schellenberger and I did our collaborations, we've had 2 collaborations. Reed, can you pull those up if you don't mind? The collaborations I did with Schellenberger. I did one with Bruce Gillian, James Lindsay, and then I did one with Michael Schellenberger. And the charts that we had, the classification charts that we had, the trans stuff was always just, those lists were just, they just kept going on and on. It's just like layers of insanity on top of insanity. And how these individuals and the people who support these ideologies, here's the woke psychopathology, a taxonomy, and we broke it down to Read, blow that up the whole screen if you don't mind. Race, climate change, and trans, and then we attention seeking, grandiosity, emotional dysregulation, excessive empathy, victimhood ideology, impaired reality testing, a lack of empathy, and splitting. And there's the splitting again.
Hey, they're splitting.
Yep. And we did those for 3 categories. And the trans ones we had to narrow down because there had so many items in each category.
Well, it shows how valuable It is to have a strong clinical formulation of what's happening, and to have a kind of a treatment plan for how to confront these, because we're dealing with difficult types of psychological processes.
Let me ask you a personal question, if you don't mind. When your field fell to this ideology, did you feel like, oh my God, it happened to my field?
Sorry, you cut out for a second. Can you say that one more time?
Sure. When your field fell to the ideology, did you feel a deep disappointment? Like, oh, it happened to my field?
Yeah, I would have thought that being fluent in these concepts would have helped them avoid this type of thing. If you think about what field is an emphasis on talking about it and having dialogue more central than the mental health field, where every issue, the solution is let's talk about it, let's have a dialogue, let's have a mature conversation. I mean, that's the treatment. That's the center of every single thing that's done in the mental health field. And then when these ideologies came in, they just said, okay, we're getting rid of that, not dialogue here.
Yep.
Here, the way to deal with it is shame and destroy and intimidate, and control and fire and censor
and personally
people.
Attack.
It's like all the stuff that's the opposite of what you would do in any other clinical situation. It just all got flipped. And so few people had the courage to say, no, we can't do this. We're going to destroy our field if we go down this road.
Yeah, that's how I felt with philosophy when it happened to philosophy. And, it's largely in the street epistemology community, quote unquote community. I think that's an overused word now. Individuals who valued dialectic and conversation, when those individuals were asked to have a conversation about something, they said no and instead attacked individuals personally. I think the field of philosophy, it was deeply disappointing to me to see that they became the mouthpieces for the orthodoxy, and they didn't challenge and they didn't question, and they just went along with it. Not only did they go along with it, but they used their intellectual horsepower to prop it up. And now that in spite of my losing my $1,000 bet with Rufo, now that the ideology has fallen into somewhat of an ill repute, again, there's no apologies. There's no like, oh boy, we fell for this. We screwed up. I just find the whole thing so disheartening at so many levels. It's just heartbreaking to me.
And the mental health field, I'll say this is something I still believe, that this is the field that could help so much with these problems. Help with institutional insanity, help people who are being attacked and threatened, help people who are being canceled, help people who are self-censoring. We should be helping and figuring out how to solve all these problems and use our tools for good. It's not even just that we're not doing that, but so much of the field is piling on and contributing to the dysfunction. So it's a double loss.
It's the opposite of your job. Your job is literally to help people. That's literally what your job is.
Right. Exactly.
So great. So thank you so much for talking to me, and a good doctor. Where can people find your work?
Okay. Well, the website is opentherapyinstitute.org. I'm becoming more active on Twitter. You can follow me at Hartz_Ph.D. You can also follow the Institute at OpenTherapyNYC. All our other social media links are on the website. If you're a patient looking for a referral, just hit the contact form and email us, and we'll pair you with somebody. If you're a therapist and you want to join our network, we're looking for psychologists who have a PsyPact license. Send us a contact form. We'll schedule an interview with you. We're going to have continuing ed workshops launching soon in a couple months for therapists. That's me. Yes, and I'm kind of new to social media world, but we're going to be posting a lot coming up. And I have a weekly podcast with Leslie Elliott at the Radical Center. You can go to her channel, Leslie Elliott at the Radical Center, and we'll have a weekly podcast, each one on a different overlooked issue in mental health and what we think about it.
Ooh, excellent. Wow, that seems so interesting. Great. Well, thank you very much for your time. Keep your browser open, and thanks again for Reed. We appreciate that. There's J. Leslie Elliott. Thank you. Thank you for watching. Everything we do is under the umbrella of the National Progress Alliance, nationalprogressalliance.org. It's a nonprofit, independent 501c3. Your generous donations keep us going and keep fueling content like this. So please help us out. Make a donation. We very much appreciate it. Thank you.